Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues, today we are witnessing historical events that fall to the lot of not every generation. A multipolar world is taking shape before our eyes, which should have appeared 30 years ago, after the end of the Cold War, drawing a line under the ideological confrontation between the USSR and the West. Then the world was full of hopes for a better future. Mutually beneficial cooperation of key players in the interests of all mankind, the cessation of wars, and the formation of a new indivisible security system where former adversaries would become comrades in arms and solve international problems together. Unfortunately, then this logic could not prevail, and the ideology of cooperation was gradually replaced by the philosophy of the zero-sum game. It wasn't our choice, and we have warned many times about the dangers that such logic entails. As a result, the world eventually found itself on the verge of World War III because of the anti-Russian Project Ukraine, implemented by Western countries in their geopolitical interests on our borders. Its key stage was the unconstitutional coup d'état in Kiev in February of the 2014 year, as a result of which a vociferous minority came to power with Western help, professing the ideals of extreme nationalism and Russophobia, intolerant of other opinions and everything Russian, the canonical Orthodox faith, praising the employees of Hitler's executioners, who together with them killed in the year's World War II hundreds of thousands of Jews, Gypsies, Poles, Russians, and Ukrainians. This regime has unleashed a brutal war against its Russian-speaking compatriots in the east of the country, trying to erase their identity and replace it with the ideals of Terry Ukrainian nationalism. Thus, Ukraine itself has launched a clockwork mechanism of self-destruction from hatred, intolerance, and enmity. It could have been stopped by the Minsk Agreements approved by the UN Security Council exactly 10 years ago. But instead of fulfilling them, the Kiev regime, with the patronage of its Western sponsors, as we all know today, has chosen a course for their sabotage, while actively arming and preparing for war with Russia. This mechanism was once again tried to stop by the citizens of Ukraine, three-quarters of whom in May of the 2019 year voted for the new Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, who promised to establish peace in the east of the country, protect the Russian language and the rights of Russian-speaking citizens, stop the glorification of Nazi henchmen, and restore good neighborly relations with Russia. However, after becoming president, he treacherously returned the country to its former suicidal and misanthropic course. All this time, Russia, for its part, has shown patience and endurance, not succumbing to the provocations of Kiev and its Western sponsors. At the same time, we made it clear that we would not abandon the Russian people, would not allow them to be bullied, and would not allow their identity to be forcibly reformatted. Another red line for Russia was Ukraine's accession to NATO, which created unacceptable military and strategic risks for our country. We tried to negotiate in a good way with Kiev, as well as with Washington and Brussels. But they didn't want to listen to us and take us seriously. And it was only when it became quite obvious 3 years ago that Ukraine would soon cross both of these red lines that we were forced to launch our special military operation, clearly fixing its goals. At the same time, from the very first day, we have said that we are ready to achieve the implementation of our goals in a peaceful way and give preference to it. Mr. Chairman, today the Kiev regime, being on the verge of a crushing military defeat, senselessly throws tens of thousands of Ukrainian men and women to die, the vast majority of whom have to be mobilized by force. For Zelensky and his clique, who usurped power and refused to hold elections in May last year, in violation of the Constitution of Ukraine. Any talk of peace is unacceptable, except on the basis of ultimatum and unsupported provisions of the so-called Zelensky formula on the battlefield. In his maniacal desire to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia, and instigated by some Western sponsors, primarily Great Britain, the former actor rejected the Istanbul Agreements initialed in April of the 22nd year, and also legally prohibited himself and his subordinates from any negotiations with the Russian authorities. Over the past 3 years, Ukraine has received hundreds of billions of dollars in Western aid. Western weapons flowed into the country like a river, and mercenaries supplied it with intelligence. In other words, Ukraine has become something like a private military company fighting for Western geopolitical interests. And the conflict has become a classic proxy war between Russia and NATO countries. Despite this, the Ukrainian army suffered catastrophic losses, and the capitulation of the Kiev regime was only a matter of time. We have said all this repeatedly, including from this rostrum. In an effort to draw Western countries into direct confrontation with Russia at any cost, Zelensky unleashed a suicidal aggression against the peaceful Russian region of the Kursk region in August last year. As a result, as we know today, eyewitness accounts are reliable, and hundreds of civilians were brutally killed and tortured by captured Ukrainian soldiers. The Ukrainian invaders, with the knowledge of their leader, were engaged in looting, violence, and robbery. The calculation was that Russia would respond to this barbaric action so harshly that public opinion in the West would again sympathize with Kiev. How once the clumsy provocation in Bucha helped to set up a part of the world community in an anti-Russian way. The objective investigation of the circumstances of which the Kiev regime slows down in every possible way. Zelensky's Kursk adventure, as is known, did not come true. Moreover, it only accelerated the collapse of defense on the Eastern Front, where Ukraine is sorely lacking reserves. Burned in the Kursk region. Today, the Ukrainian army controls a little more than a third of the original territory and is suffering terrible losses. In parallel, Russian troops are successfully advancing in the Donbass, in the Zaporozhye, Kherson regions, which became part of Russia, following the results of the referendum in the autumn of 2022 year. Every day brings the names of new liberated settlements and, unfortunately, new terrible figures of losses of the Ukrainian army, or rather cannon fodder, into which Zelensky turned it. Hundreds of thousands of residents are trying to return to the new Russian regions from Ukraine, debunking the claim of Ukrainian propaganda about the hatred of the inhabitants of this country towards Russians. We have spoken repeatedly. We are not fighting for territories, we are fighting for people. As we all know, the hopelessness of the situation of the Zelensky regime in recent weeks has become obvious to the main sponsor of the Kiev junta, the United States. The Republican administration that came to power, headed by President Trump, finally saw the real face of the overdue Ukrainian president, realized that he was absolutely not interested in peace in his country, as he clings to power with all his might and is afraid of democratic elections, in which he has no chance. He's not interested in anything else, and he is ready to sacrifice even the entire population of Ukraine and all its natural resources to his own power. The extremely unpleasant facts of corruption in Ukraine, which flourished under Zelensky, the theft of Western aid, and the resale of hundreds of billions of dollars worth of weapons on the black market, chilling violations of human rights and freedom of speech, for which Ukrainians bitterly nicknamed their country the Zelensky concentration camp, have disappeared and continue to hide. The number of those who want to leave Ukraine, fleeing from repression, and from being sent to the front to certain death, has exceeded all imaginable scales. But the Kiev prince does not let anyone out of the country. It is clear that under these conditions, the former comic artist who has settled in Kiev is extremely concerned about a direct conversation between Russia and the United States about how to resolve the Ukrainian crisis and eliminate the causes that led to its emergence, which would radically improve the international situation. No less panic is felt in a number of European capitals, where all these years they not only helped the Kiev clique and covered up its crimes, but also nurtured Russophobia, spread lies and fabrications about the goals and objectives of their own, and as a result inflated such a huge bubble of lies, which is now very difficult for them to get out of. They try to ignore the fact that the wind has changed and a clear request for peace has taken shape, the only obstacle in the way of which is the Kiev usurper and his European accomplices. Left without a steering wheel and window displays, these pathetic peacemakers, although at a loss, continue to mentor the rest of the world on how to live according to the rules of a beautiful garden. Dear colleagues, the draft submitted to the vote by the European Union and Ukraine today has direct relations to this bubble, and was concocted by this group, which tried, despite the realities on earth, on the one hand, to lay in it the key elements of the so-called Zelensky formula and the bankrupt Bergenstock process, and on the other, to camouflage them as much as possible, to give them rounded shapes so that the eye catches as little as possible of what repels many states of the global south from such ventures today. Figures are important to them today in order to pass them off as supporting the Kiev regime and try to prolong its agony for some more time. Ordinary Ukrainians will pay for this with their lives. Think about it. Many people ask us how it would be more correct and useful to vote on the two submitted texts, Ukrainian European and American. Today, everyone who will press the button in this hall at the time of voting on the draft of the European Union and Ukraine has a choice. Either play along with Zelensky and his sponsors, supporting their spells detached from reality, or make a clear choice in favor of practical and realistic steps that can stop military actions in Ukraine in the very near future. Don't be fooled. Vote against the Ukrainian project. Make the right decision. The second draft resolution was presented by our American colleagues. This text is definitely a step in the right direction. In order for this initiative to fully comply with the understandings reached during the Russian-American contacts at the highest level, we have amended it on the need to eliminate the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis, which, by the way, President Trump has repeatedly said, and which would contribute to its sustainable settlement, as proposed in your text. The United States, counting on the support of all sensible delegations in this room, vote for our amendment. As for the amendments submitted to this document by some states of the European Union, they are aimed at openly replacing the essence of the American text. Their adoption will turn a sound project with a shared message into another anti-Russian pamphlet with ultimatums, in the spirit of the Bergenstock process, which will only delay the settlement of the conflict, and will not differ in any way from the previous politicized products of this extraordinary special session. We will vote against these amendments by Europeans and Ukrainians and call on all member states to do the same. Thank you.